I'm a big proponent of comprehensible input.
Getting to know Ben, you.
Okay.
And the keyword that I had in my mind right now is podcast. Because I remember you texting me, you've been thinking about launching your podcast.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about that a little bit further. What kind of spark to inspire you to launch your new podcast? You could have just focused on offline class, but you're trying to take a further step. So could you say?
Maybe there are two reasons that I'm thinking about doing this quite seriously. And number one is I enjoy teaching and I hope to have a positive effect on English language learners. And this would be a way to reach a wider audience. I can only work with, there's only so many hours in the day.
Yes.
So I can only directly teach and work with a very limited number of people. But if I started something like a YouTube channel or podcast, it would be nice to know that the content I create would have a positive benefit for language learners in some way. And the second reason is I'm a big proponent of comprehensible input as the basis for learning language.
Comprehensible input. I've heard of that word from a YouTube video where language professor or specialist talks about comprehensible.
Stephen Krashen.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Essentially, what I'm saying is instead of a bottom-up approach, which is the traditional way of learning languages, which is sort of taking these little building blocks and trying to piece together sentences and things. This is the traditional way, and
yes.
Doing fill-in-the-blank exercises in a school textbook or something. I much prefer the theory that it should be top-down, which is detailed content and lots of words and messages. And when you consume enough content that is understandable, you slowly over time acquire the language.
Okay. And I have a question that I've been putting a lot of thought into.
Okay.
And probably other English learners have wondered a lot, which is I totally agree with the idea that we need to have as many comprehensible inputs as possible, like which is called top-down approach.
Yep.
Top-down approach.
That's right.
But one of the problems that sometimes happen to English learners is that when they try to watch, let's say, a Netflix, in order to get more comprehensible input, sometimes they can't exactly what characters in the movies say in English, and even if they turn on subtitles, because they speak so fast or sometimes make sounds a little bit blurry or ambiguous, they cannot have so-called incomprehensible inputs. So if a student that you've been teaching ask this question to you, so what would you give the answer to that student?
Okay, so there's a few ideas. One being that you should focus on the sentences and the parts of the show that are just out of reach. There should be, it's called N+1,
Okay.
which is the idea where you understand, if there are 10 words in a sentence, you should understand 9 of them, and 1 of them should be a new word or concept. And so that sentence would be a good piece of learning material. If there are too many unknowns in a sentence, it's a level beyond where you are, and instead you would get better results by focusing on cherry picking. And that's really difficult to do because you have to accept ambiguity. You don't always understand. But the idea is that after much more comprehensible input, eventually you would reach a point where you come back around to that content, and that sentence that you really wanted to, you were striving to understand, eventually will be understandable.
Okay.
So that's one sort of way. But another way is just to try and make it more comprehensible. If you're trying to find an expression that you really want to learn, but you don't understand it in that context, find it in another context. So search for this expression in many sample sentences and pick one that you do understand. And eventually you will grow to sort of, you will gain an understanding of it.
I couldn't agree with you more. So there are many approaches to acquire foreign languages. And then I feel like you might have that idea from the experience that you tried to learn Korean. Is that really correct?
So I guess you could say that I'm sort of a failed Korean learner, right? In the sense that I'm not fluent in the language.
Okay.
I have learned from my own mistakes, which is that I tried it the traditional way, the textbooks, the segmented way of doing things, grammar point by grammar point, or these different things. And it doesn't work. It's like you're trying to paint the largest room in the world, and you're not going to do it with a tiny brush, bit by bit. You need that much wider kind of roller where you're just diving in to sort of absorb as much as you can. And it came from learning that I did it the wrong way, and then researching it and finding out about Stephen Krashen and comprehensible input and things like that.
Okay. I have to point out that I like the way you use a analogy to explain your idea, such as you just mentioned that use the, what is that, roller?
Yeah, like a paint roller.
And then cherry picking.
Yeah, cherry picking.
Although I've never heard of those kinds of expressions, I'm happy that I can understand what you're saying right now.
That's great.
So I think it's so true that English is a analogy language, especially compared to Korean. And I also have to say that the more and the longer I study English, so rather I would say I try to expose myself to comprehensible inputs. And these days, for example, I try to watch as many Netflix as possible, at least for an hour a day. Then I've realized that there is no way for me to understand every single context, every single expression that appear in the movies. If I kind of was obsessed with the perfection that I have to understand every single word, then I was meant to fail, or I was destined to fail, because I would be running out of my energy. I would be really exhausted. Oh, I'm out of breath. I'm still nervous.
Take your time.